Hello, good morning. Welcome to this week's episode of Learn with Lorna. This is episode number 216, where we are looking at the subject of kelp in our collections. My name is Lorna Steele-McGinn. I'm the Community Engagement Officer with the Highland Archive Service, which has 4 archive centres in the Highlands of Scotland, one in Inverness, in Fort William, in Portree and in Wick, where we look after records relating to the Highlands and Islands. This series is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there is no payment or subscription required to take part in the series. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we are very grateful for that. So as I say, today we are looking at the subject of kelp, and I mentioned all 4 of our offices, and it's nice today I've got examples and contributions from all 4 offices, which is always lovely. Kelp has played a really important part in the story of the Highlands and Islands over the centuries. It has contributed to times of growth, providing employment and income, more to some than to others, but it's also been a substantial factor in times of decline and hardship, and plays part of the story of mass emigration from the Highlands and Islands. And some of you will be aware of this or some of this, but others may not. So we're going to start with looking at what kelp is and why has it been so central to our story over the years. So I'm going to start with an overview of kelp from Nature Scot, Scotland's nature agency. And they say kelps are large brown seaweeds that grow on underwater rocks from low tide downwards all round Scotland's coasts. Kelp beds are a priority marine feature in Scotland's seas. They provide food and shelter for many marine animals, supporting food chains that include species of commercial significance, and play a big role in recycling coastal nutrients. There are 3 particular types of kelp that are common within Scottish waters. Laminaria digitata, the main kelp seen on our seashores, growing in a narrow band around low water. Cuvie kelp, which is the main forest forming kelp in Scotland, visible at the lowest tides. Sugar kelp, which only forms forests in very sheltered areas. And a 4th one, furbelows kelp, a quick growing annual kelp which may form forests where storms have removed other kelps. So we're looking at types of seaweed that grow around the coast of Scotland. They go on to say kelps have no roots. Instead, they attach to rocks with tough branched holdfasts. In place of true stems, they have stiff stipes which hold them upwards towards the sunlight. Dense forests of cuvie kelp develop wherever there is a bedrock or large stable boulders for attachment. They grow best in strong water movement from either waves or currents. It says that they only grow at around 5 metres because they need good sunlight, but in St Kilda's clear waters they can grow to depths of more than 30 metres. So kelp is a variety, kelps are varieties of seaweed which grow around the coast of Scotland and which now form part of marine protected areas, and which are harvested now in a sustained and manageable way to ensure the long-term preservation of the beds. And we'll come back to that at the end of why they're still used. Okay, so far you're possibly thinking, why is she talking so much about seaweed? So why has kelp been important? Why has it been harvested at all? What happens to it? What's it used for? Well, as I said, kelps are types of seaweed, but the word is also used to refer to the ashes of those seaweeds when burnt. So if people are talking about kelp, they might be talking about the raw material of the seaweed, or they might be talking about the burnt product of the ashes. So I'm going to turn to Richard de Varia's article, Kelp, How Seaweed Brought Hardship and a Measure of Prosperity to the People of the Highlands, which was published in the 2000s and which we hold a copy of in our Skye and Loch Archive Centre. And he says, kelp is the ashes of seaweed, and its important property is that it is a source of alkali. But what's alkali, and why is that necessary? Alkalis are a class of substances which neutralise acids. Common examples are sodas, potash and lime, which combine with acid to make a salt. Traditionally, the most important uses for alkalis were in making soap and glass. Alkali was also used in making alum, which was used in dyeing. In addition, potash was used in the manufacture of saltpetre, which would then be used in gunpowders, fertilisers, food preservation and other applications. So getting alkali was really important, and one way of getting alkali was to get it from the kelp. Traditionally, ashes, to get the traditional source of alkali, ashes were made by burning wood because there was so much potash to be found in those ashes. So that was traditionally how we got that source of alkali in the UK, which we would then use for all of those multiple purposes. So as I say, traditionally it would be used, the alkali would be obtained by burning trees. But there were other demands historically on the supply of wood that could be used to produce that alkali, especially at the time of around the Industrial Revolution, where the wood was being used in iron smelting industries and so on. So prices of trees to burn to create this alkali were being pushed up and supplies were being pushed down. And so they started to look for another supply of alkali. Now, so far, so scientific, and some of you might be interested in science. Science and maths, not my things, but I think it's helpful to understand that, because understanding what we used it for and why it was valuable and precious and important helps to understand why the story becomes so dramatic. So we needed supplies of alkali. And the first thing we did was look elsewhere. So we imported wood to burn to ash or ashes from the Baltic, from North America, and sometimes we looked for alternate substances. But as we know, if we know anything from our recent history, it's a very precarious position to be in if your supplies of something vital and something that has so many uses as that does, if those supplies are coming from another country and you're reliant on another country for something vital, in times of conflict or in times of crisis, that supply can be reduced, it can be stopped, or the price can be greatly inflated, and I'll come back to that shortly. So, was there an alternative, something that could be burnt to produce potash and alkali locally? Yes, there was. So if we go back to that Richard de Veria paper, then we start to see why we turned to kelp. As early as the year 1661, the traveller John Ray reported that glass was made at Preston Pans, East Lothian. Kelp and local sand were heated and calcined in crucibles, which were also made locally. Kelp, as a commodity for sale, was produced in the first place on the Firth of Forth in 1720. The industry began in the Orkney Islands in 1722. From about 1730, kelp began to be burned in the Western Isles. The work was introduced by MacLeod of Uist. Then, in the year 1735, Hugh MacDonald of Balshare brought a man called Roderick MacDonald, or Ruri Nalua, Roderick of the Ashes, over from Ireland, and he introduced the practice of kelp making to North Uist. At the same time, workers were brought from Ireland in order to give training to the islanders on how kelp could be made. Between the years 1746 to 1762, some of those Irishmen obtained tax leases on the kelp shores in Tiree, Berneray and other places. There was plenty of seaweed on the shores, and after being cut, it would grow again naturally. A lot of labour was required, but simple equipment was needed. After 1750, the industry gradually spread to the other islands until it reached Uist, Barra, Harris, Skye, Lewis and Mull. In addition, kelp was burned on the shores of Ardnamurchan, Soonart and Morven on the mainland. During the 18th century, the demand for kelp was steadily increasing. The tax on ashes and on barilla, I'll come back to barilla, from abroad protected the industry. Also, because of the wars on the continent in Europe, alkali from abroad wasn't always available, and therefore the price of kelp rose steadily. By the year 1790, the kelp industry was important from Kintyre to Cape Wrath, and it was the principal industry in the Highlands and Islands. Nevertheless, there was more kelp produced in the Orkney Islands than in the Western Isles. So, kelp, now that we've realised what we can use it for and we realise it makes us not dependent on other countries, becomes a very significant industry in the Highlands and Islands. And you'll see there examples of what I was talking about. If the kelp can be the plant, but it can also be the ash. So they talk about how to make kelp, and that's the ash produce. So it becomes very significant, and evidence of this can be seen within the statistical accounts. So when I searched the statistical accounts, first and second, for the word kelp, I came back with over 220 references to the manufacture and production of kelp. And here are just a few examples from the first statistical account of the 1790s. This one is from North Uist, which was then in Inverness-shire. Kelp is the principal part of the produce of this parish, the manufacturing of which was totally unknown here, and as in every other part of the Highlands, until about the year 1735. The quantity of kelp manufactured yearly in this parish will amount to little more than 1,200 tonnes, the greatest part of which is in the hands of the proprietor. 150 tonnes belong to Mr. MacLean of Borry, and the rest to principal tacksmen whose leases are not yet expired. All the inhabitants of this parish are employed in the manufacturing of kelp from the 10th of June until the 10th of August, excepting the principal tacksmen and their servants, with a few tradesmen. So that really gives an idea of the scale, that almost everybody in North Uist is involved to some extent in the production of kelp. And given that it's only in the early to mid 1700s that we start doing it, you can see how quickly it becomes a huge industry. So we associate it particularly with the Western Isles and with the Orkney Islands, but this is an extract from the first statistical account of Canisby in Caithness. The shores of Canisby are exceedingly valuable, yielding about 100 tonnes of kelp in a favourable season, which is near as much as is made in all the rest of Caithness. And this one is the first statistical account from Portree. Since the manufacturing of kelp became an object of importance, great numbers prefer it, though troublesome, to any other work, because in it they can earn from 1 shilling 6pence to 3 shillings a week, according to their labours. The book Caithness in the 18th Century by Johnny Donaldson contains an entire section on kelp, detailing the role that the Wick and Thurso merchants played in selling and transporting the kelp, using their contacts of merchants around the coast to ship the kelp out of Caithness, and also includes reference to the details of the way in which the shores were sometimes leased out by the landowners. In those statistical accounts, particularly the first, the 1790s accounts, numerous coastal parishes make reference to kelp, even if their reference is only to say we have sandy shores without many rocks, and so we can only manufacture a few tonnes of kelp a year. Even the lack of a large industry is something deemed worthy of comment because it's such an important industry. Now, when I say that the parishes were manufacturing kelp, what do I mean by that, given that this is something that's a natural product? Well, the seaweed had to be cut. Strands that were thrown up onto the shore naturally by storm waters or waves generally weren't made or burned down to make into ash. Instead, those were used usually as fertiliser for crops, and we see that through the statistical accounts too, that if they don't have enough to have a substantial manufacturing process, the parishes will say that the kelp they can produce is being used as fertiliser locally. So the seaweed had to be cut, and it was cut at low tide, either from the seabed or from the rocks. And it was then dragged up onto the shore to be dried and burnt in kilns nearby. Richard de Veria notes that this burning would result in a hot, sticky mass, which was then cooled and covered with earth, ready to be cut into blocks, into pieces to be shipped around the UK. And you get a description even from that of the going into the water and cutting it and dragging it up the shore, the burning, the hot, sticky mass, the heat. You get the feeling that this is heavy, dirty, exhausting work. And it would be hot and unpleasant round the fires in the kilns, but it would be cold and uncomfortable in pulling the kelp up from the seashore. But there was money to be made from it. So who's profiting from this, and by how much? Well, it's a business that fluctuated massively, but the landowners who controlled and owned the shorelines made substantially more than those working at lifting and cutting and burning the kelp. The second statistical account for South Uist says this: kelp is the only article manufactured in this parish. While the price continued good, the proprietors were unable to pay high wages for manufacture and the people were unable to maintain themselves comfortably. I think that's all relative. But the taking off of the duty of salt and sulphur has meant that the price of kelp has been so much reduced that the article is hardly worth the making. In this way, the value of the principal estate of the parish has been reduced from £15,000 a year to less than £5,000 a year. The wages of kelp makers has been consequently reduced, and indeed the manufacture would not be continued at all, but to enable tenants to pay rents. The number of persons employed in the manufacture of kelp in this parish is 1,872, including young persons of both sexes between 12 and 16 years. It is a healthy employment and has no bad effect on the morals of the young people involved in it. In dry weather, the work is carried on at an average of 8 hours a day, but the persons employed in the burning of the ware and working it when burnt till it becomes liquid, with their irons fixed on long poles, have a very warm and troublesome task, and are often engaged for 16 hours together. The quality has been much improved during the last 20 years. The weed is only allowed 2 years' growth before it is cut, instead of 3 or 4 years as formerly, which is considered by some people to be prejudicial to the quality and the strength of the kelp. So they're adapting the industry, but the wages have lately been reduced from £3 3 shillings and £2 12 shillings 6 to £2 per tonne, the latter of which is still considered a fair remuneration in good seasons, but very inadequate in rainy summers. The work begins about the middle of June and is finished when the weather is propitious by the beginning and middle of August. So, a substantial amount of money can be made, but you can see from that extract just how much that fluctuates according to the crop, the weather, the economy, the global situation, as we'll see in a minute. So a substantial amount of wealth can be made from, and did come to the Highlands and Islands from kelp, but largely to the landowners. And that wealth didn't translate to high wages. Instead, landowners raised rents, reorganised land tenures, forcing farming tenants to take on more employment in kelp instead. I mentioned there that wages had gone down to £2 per tonne, and to put that into perspective, it's been estimated that individual landowners' earnings were in the tens of thousands some years. They controlled the access to the kelp, they controlled access to the shoreline, and they dictated who could work on it. So tens of thousands of pounds going to some people and £2 per tonne going to some others. However, the industry did provide some form of income and sustenance to tenants, especially those who had already been cleared to the coastal areas of estates during the first wave of the Highland clearances, because kelp plays a big part in that story. In Lorna Archive Centre, we hold papers relating to the kelp industry in Morven, which reference this, the fact that the role that kelp plays in delaying and then speeding up the Highland clearances. So this article says 2 dates, 1800 and 1819, mark the real end of the old order in Morven, when the Maclean and Argyll estates were sold off. The new proprietors were outsiders, many from the south, who were all mostly non-resident on their estates and felt very little responsibility towards the communities there. They were quick to convert the estates to large profit-making sheep farms. Small farms were united to form large ones, and the cotters and small tenants, who had no legal right of tenure under Scottish law, were cleared by large-scale eviction. In the first 50 years of the 19th century, around 1,730 people emigrated from Morven to Australia, to America or Canada, or to industrial areas across the UK. But that doesn't really take off at this point. What takes off at this point is the landlords moving tenants from those good arable areas and estates out to the coasts to work in kelp industries. The article continues, a rapidly expanding population in the late 18th century, along with the removal of their means of subsistence, meant disaster for the community. This was only temporarily delayed by the growth of the kelp industry, which provided employment during the first 30 years of the 19th century. However, with the decline of the kelp market after 1830, the now superfluous native population were once again without the means of making a living. So many tenants found themselves in the mid to late 1700s cleared off arable land which could be used by those landowners for sheep or deer farming, and instead eking out a living in the kelp industry. But that extract there mentioned that the kelp industry provided a living for the first years of the 19th century before it collapsed. So why was that? Why was the boom and why was the bust? Well, what was happening? That's what you need to look at, the context of what was happening from the 1790s to the 1810s. The French Revolutionary Wars were happening, and then the Napoleonic Wars. And as I said earlier, as we know currently, what happens during a war often is that the trade and the movement of vital products is curtailed, and the movement of produce between countries is either reduced, completely cut off, or prices are massively inflated. And that is exactly what happened at this period. So we've discovered this kelp industry, we've grown it to a big scale, but then because of the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, Britain's trade with Europe is curtailed. Britain becomes unable to purchase the cheap barilla from the continent. Barilla was another alkali source, like kelp, another cheap way of pulling alkali out of a product. And that market is cut off to Britain because of the Napoleonic Wars. And this meant that it became really worthwhile to manufacture our own, and the prices of kelp rose. So it was a boom time in the industry which lasted for around 2 decades, where there was a lot of money to be made from harvesting and manufacturing our own kelp and then our own alkali to use in whatever way it was needed. But after the fall of Napoleon of Waterloo and the resumption of Britain's trade with Europe, Scottish kelp prices fell off a cliff because cheaper materials could once again be imported. The import duty on barilla was dropped, and also in the early 1800s we started to import potash from Germany. And it's really interesting, I was speaking last week about street names and all the streets named after Waterloo and all of the the way that those victories were memorialised. But in gaining that victory, something else has to give somewhere along the line. And one of the things that gave in the Highlands and Islands was the kelp industry. So we have this period of huge growth when the demand is there and other markets are closed off to us, that the prices rise and it's worthwhile manufacturing. But then when those markets reopen again and the market's flooded with alkali from other places, our prices drop off a cliff. And I was completely fascinated to read about the impact of this within the minute books of the Inverness Commissioners of Supply. And it was actually stumbling across this entry that made me think I must do an episode on kelp. On the 5th of February 1823, a meeting was called when Mr. Anderson, who was a member of the Committee on the Barilla question, reported back to the Commissioners of Supply and shared with the meeting a copy of a memorial by the proprietors of the kelp estates in the Western Islands and on the coasts of Scotland, and by the heritors of the county of Orkney, written to the Lords of His Majesty's Treasury. So all of these interested parties, not the workers on the shores, but the landowners, the kelp estate owners across Scotland, have come together to petition the government about the drop in prices on Scottish kelp. And this meeting records that they passed various resolutions regarding the dramatic reduction of import duties on barilla. They dropped the import cost, or the import duties on barilla by nearly half, and they lifted the salt tax, meaning why would anybody buy locally when they could get it much cheaper now from overseas? So they noted their feelings about this and their frustration at the speed of this decision, the fact that the law had been passed dropping the barilla duties, which meant that there was no kelp industry locally worth manufacturing anymore. So they note that decision was taken so quickly and that they had no place to voice their opposition to an act so injurious to them as kelp shore owners. But I found some of their comments about this really, really fascinating. So they say, they resolve unanimously, point 5, that the manufacture of kelp gives employment and sustenance to not fewer than 80,000 individuals personally engaged in it, besides at least equal numbers who are also indirectly supported from their labour, as is proved by the evidence lately taken before the Honourable Commons House of Parliament. So they're saying 80,000 people work in this industry directly, and then potentially an equal number who are reliant on those people. Point 6, they say that this meeting has reason to believe from the statements made to it that not less than from 150 to 200 ships are annually employed in the transport of the manufacture to different parts of the United Kingdom. So they're saying it's not just the people on the shores cutting the kelp and burning it, it's also then all the ships who have employment in transporting the kelp. Point 7, they say that not less than 30,000 tonnes of kelp are annually manufactured within the Highlands and Islands of Scotland alone. So the argument being that if you go ahead with this, if you cut the import duties on Barilla and you drop the bottom out of the market of Scottish kelp, tens of thousands of people will lose their livelihood, and tens of thousands more will be affected by the collapse of the kelp industry. And this group of landowners also make a note that kelp estates have been handed down through generations in the same way that other estates have been, and landowners have always been able to make decisions about the manufacture on their land, and they are not happy that suddenly what has been a very profitable industry for them has been ripped away. They record their opinion that with Barilla duties reduced so low, kelp will be completely excluded from the market, nationally and internationally. Its manufacturing costs won't cover wages and freight, and the industry will be completely abandoned with immediate effect. They also noted that the areas who will be most affected by this, like the Western Isles, don't have many other industries that can be scaled in the same way. They don't have loads of manufacturing possibilities or huge agricultural wealth. And they conclude that the consequences of continuing the said act will be to injure most materially the shipping interests of this county, to lessen the great nursery of our seamen in the coal and coasting trade, to ruin the proprietors of kelp estates, to shake the foundations of securities hitherto continued firm, and suddenly to consign many thousand industrious individuals to want and beggary. So there are strong words there. They also add that there doesn't even seem to be any sort of compensation or advantage or benefit that's been thought to be included. The Commissioners of Supply at this meeting add a resolution that they want a repeal of the lowering of the duty on the importation of Barilla, and that they are setting out this to show the inexpediency, the danger, and the calamitous result of such a sudden and uncalled for innovation, which necessarily awakened the attention of this county to the defence of the interests of so large a part of its population and the source of so much of its wealth. So as I say, it was that extract that made me think I must do an episode, because it was so strongly written and worded. But when I turned the page, at the same meeting, they went on to discuss, the heading is, "The present agricultural distress, unparalleled in the history of the kingdom, and most severely felt in this county, which has reached a height which threatens the most alarming consequences." And I just found that those two meeting points, side by side, really painted a picture of the situation faced by many thousands of people in the Highlands and Islands in the early to mid 1800s, many of whom had already been cleared from their homes to the coasts to work in the kelp industry. If the kelp industry collapses and the agricultural industry is in such a state of distress, what is there for them? Where do they go next? And it's after this, and incidentally that petition to Parliament did not work, but it's after this that we start to see further widespread devastation and widespread emigration to Australia, to Canada, to America, and the end of large-scale kelp manufacture in the Highlands and Islands. Now, the kelp industry has continued to go in fits and starts, but it's never really been at the scale that it was in the 1700s and 1800s. As I say, there's been waves where things have been discovered or come in that has brought a boost back to the industry. For instance, in the 1800s, it was discovered that iodine could be produced from kelp, but it was fiddly and it was time consuming. So although it was done, it didn't become a huge industry. I found within the Inverness County Clerk's papers a series of papers relating to an attempt to reboot the kelp industry in World War One, and I found it a really interesting parallel to 100 years earlier, that it was once again, it was the prospect of war which prompted us to look at the resources we had around us. Could we use anything from within our own shoreline to mean that we wouldn't be reliant on other countries? This is what the article says. This is 1914. One of the indirect results of this present war and the consequent cessation of imports from belligerents abroad has been to direct attention in many interested quarters to the prospect of a revival in the kelp industry in the Highlands, which present conditions seem to favour. There are 2 articles in daily use, the first a necessity in every household, and the second a drug found in every hospital and many sick rooms, viz. Soft soap and iodine, both of which can be and have been produced from kelp. Both of these are now manufactured abroad. Soft soap is largely imported from Germany, being produced from the potash to be found in large quantities in the towns of Stassfurt and Magdeburg, both in Prussia. Iodine is a byproduct of kelp, and kelp is gathered on the west coast of Scotland and of recent years on a larger scale in Japan and California. But the bulk of the iodine that finds its way into the market comes from the nitrate beds of Chile and Peru. The life of these beds, so far as may be at present estimated, is limited, and it is said that they may be exhausted within the next quarter of a century. If this be so, the prospects of a revival of the kelp industry in the Highlands do not seem remote, and they afford at least good reason why investigation and inquiry into the best methods for attaining that end should not be further delayed. And John Hendrick, who was an agricultural chemist, carried out an investigation through a grant from the Board of Agriculture. And he said, and again, a huge parallel to the Napoleonic Wars, he said, "I am undertaking this work and giving of my own services solely with the hope of improving the seaweed industry and increasing the supplies of potash and iodine that can be produced in Scotland itself, thus helping to make us independent of German potash mines." And so investigations were underway. The County Council of Argyll set up a kelp industry committee. A conference was held in Edinburgh. And in another echo to the past, the County Council of Argyll noted that they thought that if they could revive the kelp industry, it would be a means of alleviating unemployment and distress found in the Western Highlands at the present time. So kelp has always been interlinked with conflict, with economy, and with distress and unemployment. So they put out a call to see would anybody be interested in reviving the kelp industry. And we hold various pieces of correspondence from people in different areas of the Highlands and Islands giving their opinions on the resumption of the industry. So for instance, John MacDonald in South Uist noted, "The market is limited and practically one company has the monopoly. There are only 3 companies in Scotland who now buy kelp, and 2 of them are only in a small way." He notes that it would be a disaster for South Uist to produce kelp and hold it until a better market appears. He says it's been suggested that we produce it and then hold it back waiting for the prices to rise, but he said it'll decrease in value by the day and we would produce about 1,000 tonnes a year, so where are we keeping all of that? In Skye, MacDonald and Fraser of the Skye District Committee wrote back to say there's not much kelp in Skye and they don't think there's anything to be gained by revisiting this industry. But H. Mackenzie, writing in North Uist, noted that the industry had never quite been abandoned there in the Uist or in Tiree. And he details all the current work that was happening. So for instance, he says in 1914, 188 tonnes had been produced. But he says that if the blackweed kelp could be revived, that would be a boon indeed to the west and north coast small tenants. So interesting just to hear all those different opinions about what could or couldn't be done. And kelp was indeed used in World War One, in the production of nitroglycerine and explosives, and in other things, although I haven't looked into the scale of how much of that came from the Highlands and Islands. But I did see that California produced a huge amount of kelp at this time. And then through the rest of the 20th century, kelp was harvested for the alganates industry, used in foods and cosmetics and medical supplies, but just not to the same scale as when the industry had been at its height, and certainly not involving the same number of people. Maurice Pottinger, who you may remember was the focus of Lorna 194, collection held in our Nucleus, our Caithness archives, he shared his memories of the kelp industry within his lifetime. Kelp making was one of our pre-war tasks in Stronsay, so pre-Second World War, although it had a very long history, going back to the 1700s, when James Fay of Whitehall began the industry in Stronsay. There were many crofters in Rowsham who made a bit of their living by burning kelp when they could. The work would go on all summer as other work allowed, fitting in with farm work and herring fishing season. Even if the men were down in the village carting herring or employed in other work, the croft women would be gathering seaweed for kelp burning as available, carrying it laboriously above the beach. We looked out from Whitehall down to the Ness, part of the farm anyway, and we saw the spirals of heavy grey, acrid white smoke drifting skywards. The crusted, burnt kelp ash was broken up, raked over, and then carted to store, ready for shipping at the end of the season. Normally that would be late in August. Then harvest and wetter weather would put a stop to the kelp work, the men returning each to their own harvests. But like so many cottage industries that once sustained our countryside, the kelp industry is now long gone. Now, in fact, kelp today is still harvested and used. You might find it in sushi, you might find it in skincare products or numerous other places. But next time you come into contact with it or you see it written somewhere, perhaps you'll be able to think about its connection not only to the Highlands and Islands, but the fact that it played a role in our World War I story, in the Napoleonic Wars and the Highland clearances, and in the lives of so many thousands of people. So I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you've heard something you didn't know maybe. A reminder that next week we will be looking at the subject of fighting fire in our collections, looking at stories of fires and firefighters. But a reminder until then that this series is brought to you by High Life Highland, that High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and there's no payment or subscription required to take part in this series of events. But if you're able to donate towards our work, then we really appreciate that. Thank you.